May 12, 1942, 14:37 hours, Trent Park, North London, England. The staff car rolled through iron gates and up a tree-lined drive that looked nothing like captivity. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma sat in the back seat, still wearing his Afrika Korps uniform, dust-stained, decorated with medals earned across 2 wars, the fabric carrying the smell of North African sand and defeat. His hands rested on his knees, not bound, not restrained. Just resting. Like a guest being driven to a country estate. Which, impossibly, was exactly what this appeared to be. The car stopped in front of a grand mansion, 3 stories of Georgian elegance, windows reflecting afternoon sun, ivy climbing stone walls with the patience of centuries. Trent Park. A stately home that had once belonged to aristocracy, now requisitioned by British intelligence for purposes the general could only imagine. He expected a fortress. Barbed wire. Guard towers. The architecture of punishment. What he saw instead was a building that could have hosted garden parties and diplomatic receptions, surrounded by manicured grounds that rolled toward distant woods like something from a landscape painting. A British officer approached, not a guard, an officer, with the bearing of someone welcoming an equal rather than processing a prisoner. He spoke in German, accented but fluent. General von Thoma, welcome to Trent Park. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your quarters. Not your cell. Your quarters. The general stepped from the car, boots on gravel, and felt the entire structure of his expectations collapse. They expected degradation. They received hospitality. And nothing in the war had prepared them for that. General von Thoma had been captured 3 days earlier at El Alamein. His command, the Afrika Korps Armored Forces, had been shattered by Montgomery's offensive, his tanks destroyed or abandoned, his men scattered or surrendered. He had fought until fighting became suicide, then allowed himself to be taken by British forces who treated his capture with professional courtesy rather than triumphant cruelty. The journey from North Africa had been swift, military aircraft to Gibraltar, then to England, processed at an interrogation center where British intelligence officers asked questions with polite persistence. He had given name, rank, serial number, the minimum required by Geneva Convention. They had not pressed harder. Had not threatened. Had simply made notes and moved him along the processing chain with bureaucratic efficiency. Now he stood in front of a mansion, being welcomed like a houseguest, and struggled to reconcile this reality with everything propaganda had taught him about enemy brutality. The interior matched the exterior's promise. High ceilings. Elegant furnishings. A grand staircase that curved upward with architectural grace. The British officer, a captain, perhaps 35, with the accent of someone educated at good schools, led von Thoma through hallways that smelled of beeswax and old wood. Your room is on the 1st floor, General. Private quarters with an adjoining sitting room. Meals are served in the dining room at 0800, 1300, and 1900 hours. You're welcome to use the library, the billiard room, and the grounds within the marked perimeter. We ask only that you respect the boundaries and maintain proper conduct. The captain stopped at a door, opened it, stepped aside. If you need anything, ring the bell. Someone will attend to you promptly. Von Thoma entered a room that would not have been out of place in a good hotel. Bed with actual sheets. Writing desk. Armchair by the window. Carpet on the floor. Curtains, not bars, framing a view of gardens and distant trees. He turned to the captain. This is a prison? This is Trent Park, General. You're a prisoner of war, yes, but we treat officers according to their rank. The Geneva Convention requires humane treatment. We interpret that generously for general staff. Why? The captain's expression remained professionally neutral. Because you're soldiers, not criminals. Because how we treat you reflects on Britain's character. And because. He paused, choosing words carefully. Because maintaining civilization under pressure is rather the point of fighting, isn't it? He left, closing the door without locking it. Von Thoma stood alone in his quarters, listening to the silence, processing the contradiction between expectation and reality. They put me in a gentleman's room, he would write later in notes that British intelligence would read. Not from kindness, from policy. But policy delivered with such professional courtesy that it felt like respect. I had forgotten enemies could offer that. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Within a year, 10 more generals would arrive at Trent Park, each processing the same cognitive dissonance. They came from different campaigns, North Africa, Eastern Front, Western Europe, but they all expected the same fate, harsh captivity, interrogation through coercion, treatment befitting defeated enemies who had served a regime the Allies despised. Instead, they found themselves in what one general would later describe as a very strange prison that felt more like compulsory retirement at a country club. General Ludwig Krühl arrived in June 1942, captured when his aircraft was shot down over North Africa. He was escorted to Trent Park expecting a cell, found instead a room with comfortable furniture and a view of lime trees lining a formal avenue. When he asked about the treatment, a British officer replied simply, "You're a general. You'll be treated as such. We're not barbarians." General Willibald von Bottischer came in September, processed through the same bewildering welcome, shown to quarters that exceeded what he'd had in some postings during active service. He sat on the bed, soft mattress, clean linens, and thought about propaganda that had promised Allied forces would humiliate captured officers, that defeat meant degradation. The reality was stranger than brutality would have been. At least brutality would have made sense. The system that governed this treatment had been designed by British intelligence with calculated purpose. In 1940, even as Britain stood alone against Germany, the War Office had established protocols for POW treatment that prioritized three intersecting goals. Security: contented prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to attempt escape, more cooperative in their daily routines. Harsh treatment bred resentment, which bred security problems that consumed resources better spent elsewhere. Diplomacy: Germany held British officers. How Britain treated captured Germans directly influenced how Germany treated captured Britons. Reciprocity wasn't sentiment, it was strategy with lives at stake. Every German general treated well was an argument for treating British prisoners similarly. Intelligence, and this was the secret purpose, the reason Trent Park existed at all. Comfortable prisoners talked. Relaxed prisoners gossiped. Generals who felt respected as professional soldiers discussed war strategy, weapons development, internal politics, Hitler's decisions, all the intelligence British forces desperately needed. The mansion was completely bugged. Every room, every sitting area, even garden benches, all wired with hidden microphones that fed to listening stations in the basement where German-speaking intelligence officers, many of them Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution, transcribed every word. The generals never suspected. Why would they? Who would believe that such hospitality was theater, that every courtesy was calculated to encourage unguarded conversation? A memo from MI-19, dated March 1942, laid out the philosophy with clinical precision. General staff prisoners will be accommodated in conditions appropriate to their rank. Treatment will be hospitable but not excessive. The goal is to create an environment where prisoners feel sufficiently comfortable to speak freely among themselves. All conversations will be monitored and transcribed for intelligence purposes. Not kindness. Intelligence gathering. But intelligence gathering that required treating prisoners like respected colleagues rather than degraded enemies. Daily life at Trent Park followed patterns that would have been familiar to any country house guest. Wake at will, no forced roll calls. Breakfast in the dining room, served by British staff who maintained professional courtesy. Mornings spent reading in the library, stocked with German-language books confiscated from the abandoned German embassy, or walking the grounds within marked boundaries. Lunch at 1. Afternoons for correspondence, study, or recreation. Dinner at 7, followed by evenings in the billiard room or sitting rooms where generals gathered to talk, argue, reminisce. Von Thomar established himself as the unofficial camp leader, the most senior by date of capture and respected by other generals for his combat record and professional bearing. He spent his mornings writing letters to family, military analyses, observations about the war's progress. All of it read by British censors who found little of intelligence value in his official correspondence but enormous value in his casual conversations with other generals. One afternoon in the library, von Thomar discussed with General Krühl what he had seen at Peenemünde, the secret rocket development facility on Germany's Baltic coast. Just conversation between colleagues, discussing technical capabilities, speculating about timelines for deployment. In the basement, intelligence officers transcribed every word. Within days, RAF Bomber Command received targeting information that would lead to Operation Hydra, the bombing raid that delayed Germany's V-weapon program by critical months. The generals never knew. They just talked, the way officers talk when they feel safe and respected, sharing professional knowledge with peers who understood the technical details. Personal observations accumulated like intelligence reports, each general processing captivity through their own lens of experience and ideology. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff arrived in late 1943, captured in Italy after the Allied advance. He was 54, old enough to have fought in the First World War, experienced enough to recognize that something unusual was happening at Trent Park. On his third evening, sitting in the billiard room with von Thoma and Krul, he voiced what they all felt. This isn't normal captivity. Von Thoma looked up from his shot. No. It's not. Why are they doing this? Treating us like guests instead of prisoners. Because we're general staff, Krul suggested. Professional courtesy between military equals. Or, von Thoma said quietly, because comfortable prisoners are talkative prisoners. And they want us to talk. They looked at each other, considering this possibility. Then dismissed it. Too elaborate. Too expensive. Why would British intelligence invest such resources in mere eavesdropping when direct interrogation would be more efficient? They went back to their game, conversation turning to other matters, strategy, politics, speculation about the war's trajectory. In the basement, recorders captured everything. I suspected they might be listening, von Thoma would admit after the war. But the surroundings were so civilized, the treatment so consistently respectful, that it seemed paranoid to worry about it. We were just talking among ourselves. What harm could conversation do? Enormous harm, as it turned out. Or enormous good, depending on which side benefited from the intelligence. Not all generals accepted their captivity with von Thoma's philosophical resignation. Some remained aggressively pro-Nazi, defending Hitler's decisions, insisting Germany would still achieve victory. Others, confronted with the evidence of the war's trajectory visible even from captivity, began questioning everything they'd served. General Dietrich von Koltitz arrived in August 1944, captured after the fall of Paris. He had been military governor of the city, famously disobeying Hitler's order to burn Paris before surrender. At Trent Park, listening to other generals discuss war crimes witnessed on the Eastern Front, he made a statement that intelligence officers transcribed with careful attention. We all share the guilt. We went along with everything, and we half took the Nazis seriously, instead of saying to hell with you and your stupid nonsense. I misled my soldiers into believing this rubbish. I feel utterly ashamed of myself. Perhaps we bear even more guilt than these uneducated animals. It was the kind of confession that would have been unthinkable on active duty, dangerous even in regular POW camps where fervent Nazis might report dissent. But at Trent Park, among fellow generals who had all been defeated, who were all processing what they'd fought for and why, such honesty became possible. The British listened to everything. Recorded everything. Filed everything away for future use, war crimes evidence, intelligence about German military capabilities, psychological profiles that revealed how Wehrmacht leadership truly felt about Hitler and the regime they'd served. Holidays arrived with the same strange hospitality. Christmas 1943 brought special rations, whiskey for the generals, better food for festive meals, permission to organize their own celebration. British staff provided a small tree, decorations, even allowed the generals to sing German carols without interference. Von Thoma conducted an informal church service, reading from a Bible provided by the camp chaplain. The generals sang Still Nacht, Silent Night, voices blending in harmony that transcended uniform and nationality. British guards stood outside, listening but not intruding, maintaining the fiction that this was simply a group of military gentlemen observing a traditional holiday. Afterward, sitting by the fire with glasses of whiskey, von Thoma and several other generals discussed what this treatment meant, what it said about their captors, what it implied about the war's fundamental nature. They're showing us something, von Thoma said. Not just hospitality. A philosophy. That civilization can be maintained even in war. That enemies can recognize each other's humanity without betraying their cause. Or they're trying to make us feel guilty, another general suggested. To remind us that they're decent while we served a regime that wasn't. Perhaps both, von Thoma acknowledged. But regardless of motive, the result is the same. We're being treated better than we treated many of our own prisoners. That fact is inescapable. In the basement, intelligence officers transcribed the conversation, noting the general's growing awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, they had served the wrong side. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. As the war progressed toward Allied victory, the number of generals at Trent Park increased. By early 1945, 59 German generals were housed in the mansion and surrounding facilities, representing a significant portion of Hitler's high command. They organized classes, English lessons, history lectures, philosophical discussions. They formed two distinct political groups, pro-Nazi officers who insisted Germany's defeat was temporary, a setback that would be reversed, and anti-Nazi officers who recognized the regime's fundamental evil and Germany's need for radical reconstruction. The division fascinated British intelligence because it revealed Wehrmacht leadership's internal fractures. Not all German officers were fanatical Nazis. Many had served from professional duty, from patriotism, from the soldiers' commitment to orders and organization. Defeat had freed some of them to question what they'd fought for. General Walter Warlimont, captured in May 1945, spent his first weeks at Trent Park processing the information available to him: newspapers, radio broadcasts, evidence of concentration camps being liberated. He had served on Hitler's staff, had transmitted orders, had been complicit in the regime's machinery even if he hadn't personally committed atrocities. One evening, discussing the liberation of Bergen-Belsen with other generals, he said quietly, "We knew. Not details, perhaps. Not the full horror. But we knew something terrible was being done. And we didn't stop it. We didn't even try. That knowledge will define everything that comes after." It was the kind of moral reckoning that captivity made possible, that the strange safety of Trent Park's civilized treatment allowed. The British were providing not just physical comfort but psychological space, room to think, to question, to confront truths that active service had kept suppressed. The war ended in May 1945. The generals at Trent Park learned of German surrender through BBC broadcasts, listening to reports of Hitler's suicide, of unconditional surrender, of the Third Reich's complete collapse. Some received the news with resignation. Others with quiet relief. For von Thoma, who had been at Trent Park for 3 years by then, the end brought complicated feelings. Germany had lost. The regime he'd served, however skeptically toward the end, had been destroyed. Everything he'd fought for across 2 wars had ended in total defeat. But he had survived with dignity intact, had been treated with consistent respect even in captivity, had experienced firsthand that enemies could maintain civilized standards even toward those they defeated. It was a lesson in restraint, in the possibility that war didn't require abandoning every principle, that professional soldiers could recognize each other's humanity across battle lines. He wrote in a letter that would be read by British censors, "They defeated us militarily. But they also defeated us morally, by showing that civilization could persist under pressure, that victors could choose restraint over revenge. I don't know if that makes our defeat more bearable or more complete, but it's inescapable." Repatriation began in 1946, a slow process of security screening, political vetting, decisions about who could be trusted to return to Germany and participate in reconstruction. Von Thoma was held until 1948, his high rank and close association with Hitler's military leadership making British authorities cautious about release. When he finally left Trent Park, walking through the same iron gates he'd entered 6 years earlier, he carried with him memories that would shape his remaining years. He had spent the war fighting for Germany. He had spent captivity learning that Germany's enemies could be more civilized than Germany's regime had been. Back in Germany, working quietly in post-war reconstruction, he occasionally thought about that first afternoon at Trent Park, the staff car rolling up the drive, the mansion appearing through trees, the British officer welcoming him like a guest, the gradual realization that captivity would not be the degradation propaganda had promised. "They showed me something I needed to see," he told his family years later. That soldiers could be enemies without being monsters. That defeat didn't require humiliation. That even in war, some people chose to maintain standards because standards mattered more than temporary advantage. I don't know if they intended it as a lesson, but I learned it anyway. The intelligence gathered at Trent Park remained classified for decades. The generals died never knowing the full extent of British surveillance, never understanding that every conversation, every confession, every philosophical debate had been recorded and transcribed and filed away for intelligence purposes. When the transcripts were finally released in the 1990s and early 2000s, historians gained unprecedented insight into Wehrmacht leadership's actual thoughts, unguarded conversations that revealed complicity in war crimes, awareness of the Holocaust, internal disputes about Hitler's competence, genuine horror at some of what Germany had done. The conversations also revealed something else: how effectively civilized treatment could disarm psychological defenses, how hospitality could encourage honesty, how treating enemies with professional respect could yield intelligence that coercion never would. Winston Churchill, commenting on the Trent Park operation after the war, said, "The records of conversations between enemy prisoners of war afford an excellent insight into the German character and the results of the Nazi regime. But they also afforded insight into British character, into a strategic decision to maintain civilized standards even when expediency might have suggested otherwise, to treat captured generals with the respect accorded to professional soldiers even while secretly monitoring their every word." In 2023, Trent Park opened as a museum, the mansion restored to reveal its wartime secrets. Visitors walk through rooms where German generals lived in comfort, see the hidden microphone locations, read transcripts of conversations that shaped Allied intelligence. The story is told carefully, balancing the historical reality of sophisticated espionage with ethical questions about surveillance, treatment of prisoners, the costs and benefits of maintaining civilized standards. In one restored bedroom, the most heavily bugged room in the house, where General von Arnim lived and where other generals gathered for discussions, a plaque summarizes the operation's philosophy: they were treated as gentlemen so they would speak as soldiers. British intelligence understood that comfort could yield what coercion could not: the truth. The museum includes von Thomann's own words, from letters and post-war interviews: I expected a fortress. I found a mansion. I expected punishment. I received respect. And I learned that my enemies had maintained standards my own regime had abandoned. That realization was more devastating than any physical hardship could have been. If this story has shown you that the smallest acts of restraint echo through generations, if it's changed how you understand the choices ordinary people make under pressure, subscribe, because history's most profound lessons are hidden in its quietest moments. The staff car had rolled through iron gates, and General von Thoma had braced for the architecture of punishment: barbed wire, guard towers, degradation. What he found instead was a mansion. Gardens. Treatment that accorded with rank and professional courtesy. A system designed not for cruelty but for intelligence gathering, implemented through hospitality rather than coercion. That contradiction, between expectation and reality, between propaganda and experience, taught more than any interrogation could have. It revealed that enemies could be civilized. That victors could choose restraint. That professional soldiers could recognize each other's humanity even across battle lines. The British weren't being kind. They were being strategic. But strategy implemented with consistent civility achieved multiple goals: extracted intelligence, maintained security, upheld Geneva Convention standards, demonstrated that Allied forces could win while maintaining moral authority. Decades later, when the full story emerged, historians would debate the ethics of the operation: the surveillance, the manipulation, the calculated hospitality designed to encourage unguarded speech. But they couldn't debate the results: intelligence that saved lives, evidence of war crimes preserved for prosecution, insights into Wehrmacht leadership that shaped post-war policy. And they couldn't dispute what the generals themselves experienced: defeat that didn't require humiliation, captivity that didn't abandon professional respect, enemies who maintained civilized standards because standards mattered more than temporary advantage. The car had stopped. The officer had welcomed him. Von Thoma had entered a prison that looked like a gentleman's club and felt like an elaborate test of everything he thought he knew about war. He had expected degradation. He received hospitality. And in that gap between expectation and reality, he learned that civilization was a choice victors made moment by moment, policy by policy, treatment by treatment. The war had taught them fear, the peace taught them mercy. But more than mercy, it taught them that restraint could be strategic, that civilized treatment served practical purposes, that enemies maintaining professional respect toward each other wasn't weakness but the very definition of strength. The mansion stood in North London. The generals lived in comfort. The war ended. And the truth remained: how we treat defeated enemies reveals more about our civilization than how we treat them when they are dangerous.